Hello, and thank you for tuning in to the Flatirons Syndicate Motorsports Podcast. This show is brought to you by Flatirons Tuning, your source for any aftermarket or OEM Subaru parts. Be sure to check out our store at flatironstuning.com and stay tuned with Flatirons Tuning. All right. Welcome back, everybody. We're here in the shop. We got Harvey from the Boostcreep with us. And today, in fact, Harvey, on very short notice, I called you so you could come in and we could talk about this. Today, as we're recording it, this is the 18th of September.
Yes.
And just 2 days ago, we finally got this piece of information that was released about Cobb Tuning and the EPA, which is that Cobb Tuning and the EPA have now reached a settlement where Cobb Tuning has to pay a little over $2.9 million in fines to the EPA for violating the Clean Air Act. So this is it came out and then it started to spread and it sent this ripple through, kind of like the aftermarket world and whatnot. The biggest surprise to me, honestly, about this is how long it took this to actually come to the point where it is now basically done and the settlement is finally out there, because it looks like this has been in motion since like 2016, 2017, almost 8 years.
Yeah.
So this has been an 8-year process that is finally now showing the light of day.
Well, what's that timeline relative to the Volkswagen thing that happened? Do you know? When did
theory,
that happen?
I think Dieselgate was only over 3 or 4 years.
Mm-hmm.
I think this
And
is
what
long.
year was Dieselgate? That was like 15.
15, yeah, probably right around this 14 or 15.
So this must have happened immediately. Like they found out about the fact that emissions could be tampered with electronically, and then they instantly were on the case with regard to everyone, including Cobb. It would seem.
Well, I think hindsight now being what it is, like now not kind of knowing where we are. And in fact, there's a couple more pieces of information even for this year. Heck, even for this month that have also come out, which I'll touch on here in a second. But now going back, I think that Dieselgate is a big piece of this puzzle, because I think up until that point, the regulators had not really fully understood how much was possible.
Yeah.
How much manipulation was just possible with the computing power that were in these vehicles, and how many different things could be done with the computing power in these vehicles.
Yeah.
And Dieselgate was the first case where they found that out.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's what kind of set the regulators in motion in thinking in terms of these computers that are in the cars. Like, hey, we need to pay a lot more attention to the computers in the cars, the mappings of these computers in the cars. Because in the case of Dieselgate, to the best of my understanding, that's what the infraction was, is they had programmed the car to respond in such a way that it would pass the test.
Only during testing.
Only during testing.
Yeah.
But then you go out and you drive the car. I saw some.
Which is interesting compared to our job previously before all of this, where people the software made it seem like, hey, this is America, you can do whatever you want. And we, as a industry, I don't think custom tuners ever were like, oh, I'm going to program this car to go through emissions well, but then as soon as it gets off the rollers, it's going to be a dirty car. People just generally back in the day would say, hey, you came in and you removed some stuff, let me turn off those features in the software, and that way you won't have a check engine light and just go on your business. And these people didn't really worry about emissions.
Well, the funny thing to me is that it was a manufacturer. And so, like, relevant to this year, 2024, there's another judgment that has come out against Cummins. So
Yes.
Also related to diesel. It's the second largest fine ever, which behind Dieselgate, which is $1.65 billion. With a B. Dollars, because of a bunch of diesel trucks that it produced that had the same type of violation as Dieselgate.
Yeah, which was to fool emissions testing and to run poor emissions on the road, but not
pass the
during
test,
testing.
and then not pass the test if anybody was actually driving. And so, like, just real quick at the beginning, I'm going to say, if anybody's listening to this on iTunes or Spotify, and yes, the podcast is on iTunes or Spotify, there's a lot of papers on the table here because there's a lot to go over. So you're going to hear some shuffling of papers, and I apologize for that in advance. But yeah, this Cummins settlement is pretty wild. But again, like this is just happened. So Dieselgate was roughly 13, 14, 15, something like that, give or take 10 years ago. And now there's this other one that was from roughly
the same time.
period.
It must have been harder to gather all the evidence against Cummins, I assume, or to decide what to do with Cummins. Which is, it seems odd because, like, you would imagine that the U.S. government would have a harder time enforcing on a European company like Volkswagen Audi Group than they would on a Cummins, which is an American company. You would think that they could just march into Cummins and say,
I would bet you. Well, I guarantee you that there's nothing simple about any of these cases.
yeah.
And I think the Cobb case, and I want to get more into this, but I think that Cobb probably was trying to find a path through that not everybody does, and that's why the case took as long as it did, because I think they weren't willing to immediately just go, yes, we were in the wrong, and then accept, whatever penalties or whatever, or to accept that they would have to go out of business or stop doing what they were doing.
Yeah.
I think what Cobb was doing, the impression that I get now, knowing the time frame, and then when I was talking to Lance and Billy on our podcast about their flex fuel kit, and kind of the green speed change came up, and I mentioned at the time, and I'll say it again, that clearly felt like something that had to be done, not because it was something that they wanted to do. Now, knowing that this is all out in the open now, 100% it had to be done. There was almost, I can pretty much guarantee, or the impression that I have, is that they were under an ultimatum.
Oh, yeah.
You have to make this significant change. You have a very narrow window of time to do it, possibly days, possibly a day.
Oh, yeah.
And that's where the green speed.
No, there was a date. There was a date that they said, "Hey, we are under enforcement," and they let the tuners know, like, "Hey, we are under enforcement, and after this date, the software will be updated, and none of this will be possible." Right. And they didn't say like, do this. That it was more like, hey, stop doing this so that your customers can stop doing what they're doing wrong. We want to get people up to speed for compliance before this happens. They weren't, I think the difference is a lot of diesel sort of shops and companies were like, oh, we need to do this before we are out of business and make as much profit as we can. Cobb was more like, you guys need to get in line, and you should, and even for maybe a year before, if I remember right, maybe 2 years before the enforcement came down and that date came, I actually was doing some contract work for EFI University where I would do some work at Cobb just as a contractor, but I would go there and they would say, just so you know, you should stop if you are turning off any check engine lights or you're using any defeats that is in our software or that you can think of, stop doing that right now for your own good. So there was a little bit of this murmuring going through the tuning community of Cobb Protuners where it was like, hey, this is coming. And the message wasn't, this is coming, get this done as fast as you can. It was more like, comply so that we can move forward in the future.
And that's the difference. Again, thinking back, like now with hindsight that we have, you think about the green speed change that came through, and it was not a shutting off. It was not a Accessports are going away, Pro Tuning is going away. It was, we're having to make this significant change, but now it is going to be compliant. And then you think back to that being basically the starting point where they're getting the CARB certification. So the Accessport is still there. The Accessport maps now have CARB certification, which is, I mean, that's a big deal, and that's probably why they're still there. They were probably able to show that they could get certification. Like, hey, we're putting on components that make these cars perform better, but we're going to be able to pass your tests too. It's still CARB compliant.
Oh yeah.
And which like knowing about all of what has now come out, it makes total sense why Cobb would be so aggressive in getting CARB compliance. But I think that what I'm kind of reading between the lines here too is one of the reasons this probably took so long is that they had to, once they knew what they had to do, like if they decide, well, okay, I think our system can pass your CARB certification, let's run it through the test and let's verify that. Well, it's going to take time to even run it through the test and verify, like, hey, yes, this does actually pass. Yeah. We can actually get a certification. And now you see all the certifications that they have, and so that's where it's, the question here is, like, are they violating the Clean Air Act and in what ways? And obviously the judgment says yes, they were, and it specifically spells out all the ways that they felt. But, like, especially in regards to the tuning aspect of it, there's a lot of ways that it wasn't as much of an infraction as maybe it could have seemed initially. Oh, yeah. And by getting these certifications and by limiting the access that Protuners had, you're not going to be able to tune every individual car and then send every individual car through to get its own individual certification. But if you're tuning the car in such a way that you're not touching these kind of like hot wire issues,
Sure.
that like the car's probably still going to be compliant.
Oh, yeah.
You know?
Yeah, I would say so. And honestly, in that vein, I think everybody is so excited about these CARB certified maps so that you can go through emissions and whatnot. As far as custom mapping, I think it's still a gray area. But as far as the proof that is possible and the removal of the tampering in the software, it's complete. And we have, we can all, I think the biggest thing is not only people that work at Cobb, but people who are in my industry of tuning, we can sleep better at night knowing that if we work with a company that complies and that takes away these abilities to tamper with this stuff, if someone visits us from the EPA, they'll say, oh, you're using these off-the-shelf maps, you're doing everything that is compliant and CARB certified. We won't be getting fines for that because I think it still is sort of in a gray area.
And this is the thing. So like to set the context of you and I sitting here talking about this, we are we're a small company that sells parts. But that's it. And so we work with companies like Cobb. We've been a Cobb dealer as long as I've been here, so almost 20 years at this point. You're a tuner, so your primary business is to bring cars onto your dyno and get them to run properly and tune them, which kind of is tangentially related to all of this. Mm-hmm. But if Cobb wasn't doing what they're doing, like it would have a big impact on what we are able to sell because they're a manufacturer. I don't make any parts. I just get parts in from manufacturers and make them available to my customers.
Sure.
And for you need the access as a tuner to get into the ECU to tune the car.
Yeah.
And so the customer has to have that, or you have to have that access to be able to do what you do as well.
Certainly.
And so all of these recent changes or all of this going on with the EPA, I mean, it has a direct effect on us, on our day-to-day business. But because of that, then that affects our customers and what our customers can do with their vehicles and how they do it, what their choices are, that sort of thing. So,
and I mean, I think it's important to give credit to a couple other companies as well. The biggest one I would say is Injector Dynamics. The fact that their 1050cc injector could pass CARB certification with Cobb's off-the-shelf map is unheard of. I can't think of another injector that could do that, and I think I'm someone that's not only as a calibrator, I am really concerned with not making a lot of. It's not that my focus is let's get the car and make all the horsepower we can. The focus has always been on calibration and drivability, and even emissions to a certain extent. And I find that, like, I'll say this: I've had probably the worst fuel injection system I ever tuned in my life, and the dirtiest was on a BMW 2002. It was a mechanical cam-driven 3D cam.
Oh, wow.
And it made me so sick that I ended up in a decompression chamber with blood oxygen of 62%.
Oh, boy.
And they were saying, oh, you're green in tint. How are you conscious? And then I went down in the decompression chamber to several hundred feet below sea level in the water. It wasn't in the water, it was a decompression chamber, but there was a Navy SEAL diver in there. I was breathing oxygen the whole time. They were trying to keep me alive.
Oh,
so
man.
I firsthand have seen the effects of really, really bad emissions from poor controls and poor injection.
Yeah.
And then that was early in like probably 2005. That's maybe 06 that happened. Or no, that was in 07.
Okay.
But at the time, even our injectors, we had to our stuff, if anyone ever remembers, Helix injectors.
The modified stock injectors.
Modified stock injectors.
Caps off,
My job was not, when we would get up to 800 cc's or so, my job was, at that time I thought, there's nobody that can make these idle. This car is just going to die when you come to a stoplight. That's fine because it's for a drag car. It's for a race car. And that was the idea. But these days, seeing that a 1050 cc injector can actually have as good or better emissions than a factory car, that gives my job not only that confidence that I'm doing the right thing and that I'm helping the environment. It's actually amazing because that also gives us enough fuel to make quite a bit of horsepower.
Yeah, it's the thing is, like I've said it before and I'll say it again. You never count out the aftermarket because there's just too many smart and driven people and enthusiasts that are working for these companies that whatever the target you give them, they will find a way to do it. Like take a 1050cc injector, but make it so that it works so well over such a broad range of fuel flow rates that it can pass this kind of certification, because then we win as enthusiasts because the quality of that part is just so much better.
And related to that, we see Subaru go through the same trouble, where in 2004 they came out with these side feed cars. They'd used side feeds in the early 90s.
Yeah.
They went to top feeds. I was already convinced. At the time, there was even an argument about low and high impedance injectors and which were better. Yeah. And we had resistor boxes. You guys remember this if you've been around long enough.
Long time, yeah.
And so we had this argument. And then Cobb started using these side feed injectors. And it was a noticeable instantaneous difference where you'd be calibrating an engine and you'd be like, this idle isn't so good. Wait, this is on stock injectors. This is horrible. And I watched this happen, and then I watched 2 years later, and we know that the CARB certification is getting stricter each year. Yeah. You watched Subaru themselves say, maybe that was a mistake, and they went right back to top feed injectors. Yeah. And as a tuner, I'll say, as a calibrator, I instantly saw the difference in the ease of making cars idle well and calibrate them so that they drive well. It was noticeable and instantaneous. So it's similar to what we see with the 1050, where even OEMs have to continue to march forward with better controls and better electromechanical devices that are capable of being very precise.
Yeah, I mean, we as enthusiasts, we as people that work in the business and that rely on the companies that make the parts or give us the tools to put on the car, we rely on the quality of those options. The better quality of those options that we have, the better that we can recommend parts or configurations of parts to customers to make the car work the way that they want them to, and the better that you as a tuner can calibrate the car to work as its absolute best. But we need the companies to put in that work. We can't do that work. That's not what we do. We need the companies to do it. And that's, I think what I'm seeing, my impression is with this Cobb settlement and why it took so long and what actions they took is because they know that too. Is that they want to put in that work and go forward. Now, so the last case that I want to bring up here just real quick, they're in this same month of September, there's another company, and I'll put links in the description to these three cases. So the Cummins judgment, that was in January of this year, January of 2024. Cobb was obviously 2 days ago, the 16th of September. But on the 10th, there's a company called Rudy's Performance Parts in North Carolina that was actually fined $10 million. And they're a diesel performance parts company. I'm looking here at the paper. $2.4 million of the fine was basically for kind of the EPA infractions, kind of in the ballpark or in the range of what Cobb was doing. But there's a $7 million part of the fine that was a civil judgment because this company did not work with the EPA in the way the Cobb did. So they got a much different judgment and a much larger judgment. And from what I've read here, and again, the link will be in the description, and you can go read for yourself. But it sounds like that they were not cooperative with the process, and so there was a penalty there. So, and again, with the Cobb settlement, that wasn't present. So, I mean, and obviously we can see with a lot of the changes that they made, they were trying to work with the EPA to find this through road so that they could keep doing as much of what they were doing before this process all started at the end of the process.
And with Rudy's, we see that the initial sort of fine was for ignoring them, for ignoring the EPA and not even giving them your data. And then the stuff after ignoring them is 10 times worse. If you want to read the judgment. It's amazing. The guy basically took it upon himself.
Seemingly, yes. To find it. And we're not lawyers here. I'll just put the things up. And it's totally separate from Cobb, but it's ironic.
It's the opposite.
In the same month, you have the two different paths. You have the Cobb path and this Rudy's Performance Parts path. And you can see the difference in judgment and the difference kind of, I guess, in to the degree to which he was willing to work with them. And my assumption is that this company, because they're not taking the steps the Cobb did, they're probably just gone. They're just gone and buried. They are not going to be a path for those shops that supported them, for the enthusiasts that supported them, to keep doing and using stuff like the way the Cobb did. And that's the difference to me, because like now that we're sitting here, again, the surprise to me with the Cobb judgment really is the fact that it took this long. Like there have been lots of hints and rumors and stuff for many years that there was things going on with Cobb and the EPA, And it makes sense because you see some of these other judgments that have come through over the years, and you see companies that are getting fined, like Rally Sport Direct was fined a handful of years ago for selling parts, and you could read the judgment, you can see what Rally Sport Direct was fined for, and you're like, well, there's a lot of other manufacturers that make the same kind of stuff, so they got fined, but there's all these other companies.
And you do see some companies that made that other stuff where they just strangely it stops and you don't know why. And I'm sure that's the moment the EPA shows up and says, "Hey, no more of that." But you also see some of the other companies following Cobb's path.
Yeah.
And improving, say, aftermarket TGVs or something like that.
Yep.
And releasing them and saying, "Hey, we've not only this flows better on a flow bench, like we've proven this." And so you do see this innovation and sort of this seeing this success. It's almost like Normandy Beach when they finally got through. A bunch of soldiers went to the holes in the lines, and it was like
you hope,
let's all follow this path to glory, and to victory, where we aren't fighting the EPA, we are actually fighting them by complying and not even fighting them, but joining them and saying, hey, this is our only. I'll say, I don't know if anyone reads Bill Bryson, the travel writer, but he wrote this book called A Brief History of Nearly Everything.
Okay.
And when he's talking about emissions and all this kind of stuff, lead poisoning, he talks about that. It's still a big issue. But anyway, he says, the price for being wrong is money. Or the price for, if you think that there isn't this environmental impact that we have, the price for being wrong about it is extinction. The price for being right is money. Like, 1.67 billion, let's clean up, let's put scrubbers, carbon scrubbers in power plants and things like that. And another thing is people are constantly talking about the steam ship or the container ships and saying, airplanes and their emissions. And it's like, this is all cumulative, and any little bit we can do to help the earth and help our own survival on the earth, I think, is important. So I'm not trying to be an environmentalist here and tell you all how to think. I'm just saying, hey, as a person of conscience, I think, that there's that balance. The price of being wrong about it is spending money. The price of being really wrong about it is extinction.
Right.
So,
knowing... So there's been a couple other things that have come up, and I've kind of had it on the back of my mind to like try and do a video to talk about, or a podcast talking about, well, what's the current state of automotive aftermarket, or the current state of tuning, because things have obviously changed. I mean, I would say that the Green Speed update is one of the biggest catalysts for the change, but things are definitely different now than they were 2 or 3 years ago. Definitely significantly different than 5 years ago. Mm-hmm. But it's the biggest difference now, and when you and Zach were here on the podcast talking about how you're able to tune his car with the Green Speed compliant Accessport and so on and so forth, and make good power. It's the initial change was, well, everything is gone, like we can't do anything anymore. It's all off the table. And now, as time has gone on and options have come up, then it's like, well, no, we're finding new ways to do this. We're finding these paths through to be compliant. And Cobb, in doing what they've done, have been kind of at the forefront of that, a catalyst for it and at the forefront. Right? And I would say, this has always been my guess, and this is just a guess, but I think anybody listening to this, and maybe you would agree with me here, Harvey, is that, again, like you see a company like Cobb that gets fined for producing, and doing certain things. They're not the only ones that are doing these certain things. You can think 3 or 4 other companies, 5 other companies that are producing or have historically produced a lot of other parts that are exactly the same as what Cobb is doing. Well, why haven't they been fined yet? Mm-hmm. Well, the guess is like this is legal stuff. This takes time. Probably any company that you can think of that makes similar products, they're probably in some stage of negotiation with the EPA.
Yeah, I believe I've had some insider insight to it where someone mentioned to me that it was basically like this, that when they come and show up, they're like, hey, you're now under investigation. We don't know when we're going to finish our investigation. It's very open-ended, and that you should do the right thing in between now and when our investigation and when we come back.
Yeah.
So I think they don't tell you what to do, but I think it's obvious what people need to do to change their business to make it compliant.
And we can kind of see what may happen in the long run if people are not compliant with the Rudy's performance parts example.
Yeah.
And you've got to think about this, like we are both in this industry, but just from an enthusiast basis, we want these companies that do good testing, that make good products, that they give us all these good options for things to do with our cars. We want those companies to stick around.
Yeah.
And so like all these other companies that may be involved in similar cases like to what Cobb is going through, Cobb's able to navigate through it. We as enthusiasts, we want as many companies to come through that more or less in the same way that Cobb did, versus just like pay a fine, close the doors, go out of business, stop putting in the effort.
And then as a parts seller or as a calibrator, our businesses, we want to be associated with the companies that are compliant, because not only does that take away our ability to break the law, it makes us associated with a company that's shown that. And if we are cheerleaders of that type of movement, a lot of people, I mean, a lot of people got so angry with Cobb. And then when I would explain this, my end of it is that I live in Boulder, Colorado. I think some of that hippy dippy sort of environmentalism has rubbed off on me over the years, especially getting to watch forest fires head towards my house, things like that.
Yeah.
You started to say like, wow, these are more common, and people can argue whether that's just like a trend in ice age-ness or whatever, but whatever. We got it, just like Bill Bryson said, the price for being wrong is just some money, the price for other. But I'll say that we want to be associated with these companies that are doing the right thing, and we want to have the same thing. And there were initially, like mainly the customers were very upset, and it was almost a libertarian sort of response where they were, which I respect that. And they were like, hey, the government can't tell me what to do with my own stuff, and I'm like, my point of view was, hey, I was around in the 1970s when Mexico City, Los Angeles, like you would see pictures of the air, and you would see statistics about heart attacks, strokes, and respiratory illnesses, and you could see this stuff. And even recently, there have been towns in the Midwest that where diesel modification was common, and so was asthma among the elderly. There is evidence that the EPA is not just a money grabbing entity. They are trying to protect the public health.
And if you read the judgment, that's the health issues are what they stipulate. By increasing of particulate emissions, it's the health issues that is the concern.
And it's real. We saw it already, and we already saw humans turn the tide, because LA has got some pretty good air these days. Whenever you visit, it's nice. You can see the ocean now, and you couldn't see the ocean in the 70s. And it's and there's I don't know the geography there, but anyway, it's so nice to be like associated with this, to where maybe I used to have a big YouTube channel of dyno videos, and when all this stuff started coming up, part of it was my own choice because I wanted to be concentrating on cars and not being a filmer. But part of it was like, oh my gosh, I can't sleep well at night. I'm associated with a company that is under investigation for crimes. This
has been the hardest part for us, is that it's hard to figure out what we can do and what we can't do. That's been the challenge through all of this. And the hardest part of this has been the not knowing what we can do and can't do. And that's kind of back to the first part with Dieselgate. I think that's what really started the investigation going down. Like, well, this you can do this, but you can't do all of this stuff. But all of that stuff, I mean, there's literally a whole industry built around this thing. And I remember when I had Karen on from SEMA to talk about the Chevron Deference, which I think we'll get to here in a minute. It's possibly relevant to this, but not to as large of a degree as one might hope.
Oh, yeah, this would have happened either way with the Chevron.
Well, because one of her points was, the law is the law. And if the Clean Air Act is the law, and the Clean Air Act does have some very clear stipulations, like you can't remove an emissions device from a vehicle, that's the law. And if you're removing an emissions device, like your best hope is that you can show you're replacing it with an equivalent emissions device. But strictly speaking, the law is the law, and so if it's illegal, it's illegal. But it just, for some reason, it flew under the radar, was never enforced. And so this whole industry built up around basically this kind of, we'll call it a gray area maybe, that apparently is not as gray as it would seem. And so now we're getting clarification to that, and so that's where all this is rolling out. But to us as business is running businesses, you can't have like a 3-month, 6-month, a 1-year view. You've got to be looking 5 years down the road or more. And I think that the best option is we want as many options for our customers as possible.
Yeah.
And knowing the direction that things are going and what is likely happening behind the scenes at this moment, we want as many of these companies to come through on the other end of this, giving us good options and helping us to know to make sure that we're on solid ground, you know? And I mean, that's been one of the challenges for us, for me, with a website where we're putting stuff out is what can we recommend? What can we talk about? And what are the best options that we can recommend that are compliant? Because now it took a while. I think there's the initial reaction was to fight against the change, to try and stick with the old ways. Like flex fuel comes to mind here, where, well, flex fuel worked before, we want to stay with the old ways that kept flex fuel working. Well, now there's a new way to make flex fuel work, and Cobb is working to make that flex fuel option work as far back as they can, as quickly as they can.
Yeah.
But now it's one of those things where initially, when it goes away, well, can't recommend it. Like, we had Cobb refunded us, we had to send them all back. They offered refunds to their customers, but now there's a new option. So whereas initially it was gone, it was off the table.
Yeah,
well, now there's a new option that is compliant. And
I'll say there's what's neat about this idea too with the flex fuel is that, like, for a while, I'm currently having a lot of people coming in and updating to the current flex fuel. Nothing's wrong with their tune. It's just that they were missing their TGVs from previously, and now we are putting back in TGVs and updating the system. When we do that, we have these leftover parts that are possibly usable, but only to help people who have the old systems repair their old systems if they have, because there used to be a problem with the little brain box, and they would go bad. So what this says is I shouldn't do that. What I need to do now is go back to my shop and throw all those parts away, which is fine with me, and get those customers to update. We aren't going to be doing sort of collecting old parts. I mean, I remember being a beginning tuner, and when newer cars would come in, I'd be like, oh, look, I can save all these vacuum hoses and use them for custom stuff.
Oh, man.
These days, we would never do that. I buy rolls of silicon Cobb hose just because it's my favorite hose to use, and then we can make things really right. And I think that this allows us to make things really right going forward. And it sort of woke me up the other day reading this, being like, oh yeah, I am sort of doing that save the old vacuum hose thing again if I save the non-broken parts from these kits in order to... And there are legit customers who are like, hey, I'm not really polluting and I have this old kit, but you know what? The EPA says I can't do that. So it really is a thing where I think if you have any of those old parts lying around, it's in your best interest to get rid of them, just the same way you don't want to have cats lying around your shop or things like that.
And even more, it's like with the flex fuel... I mean, it seems to me like what has come out of all this is actually a better way to make flex fuel work. Yeah. You know, with all what they discovered with the CAN bus, and other companies are figuring out ways to use this CAN bus as a source to transmit information and whatnot. This is a win for us in the long term.
Oh yeah.
Because, like, you know, talking to the Cobb guys, there's a possibility where now this CAN bus can be used for data logging. Like, it could potentially open up a lot of possibilities going forward that they probably wouldn't have even gone into and looked at and figured out unless they had to go away from the old ways of wiring in their flex fuel system to find this new way. So it's possible that new and better things are going to come out of this in the long run too. So we as enthusiasts, we've just got to give these companies the time to figure out these new ways, but also support them and try and encourage them. Because again, if you're not the one that's actually making these things, we're reliant on these businesses to do the testing and the research and the development on these parts. We need to give them the time and the space to do it, and hopefully give us these better options.
Yeah.
In the end, it's all going to be there. It's just going to take a little bit of time.
Yeah. I mean, ultimately, the goal is to have happy customers who don't feel like they're being held back in any way.
And we want to give them. We want these manufacturers to give them as many good options as they can. Yeah. You know, that's the thing, and it's it's just what we have to navigate.
Yeah, and I'll say with that in mind, you know, I saw a lot of people. There was a competing suite of software that was when this all went down. And a lot of even other tune shops I saw, especially the ones who were upset with Cobb themselves. So I was saying earlier that being associated with the company that does the right thing is good in the long run. And it lets me talk on here. It lets me say, hey, I'm associated with these guys. Look, I'm not doing anything wrong, EPA, if you're watching this podcast, you know.
Yeah.
So I saw that right when that happened, we know that there's a parent company that owns both Cobb and this other software.
We've talked about it. It's Ecutech.
It's Ecutech,
I think it's
well known. They're owned by the same company.
Yeah.
A lot of tune shops bought that suite because it still could do flex fuel after Cobb stopped.
Right.
And yet, even Ecutech at that point was saying, even though they're a British-based company, they publicly said in their private forum, hey, you guys should stop doing this because we're going to take this feature out of the software soon. I'm sure the EPA has something to do with that, just the same way they can reach out to Volkswagen in Germany.
Oh, yeah.
And so I saw this, and I see customers, all these disgruntled customers going, hey, you're my favorite tuner, but did you buy the Ecutech suite? And I'm like, no, it's going to be the same thing. Why would I take your money for something that will be gone soon as well? And we saw that happen sure as day. That's what came down the line.
This is the challenge is companies that are a business in the long term. So I want to take a look at the Cobb, some of the details of the Cobb decree, because there's some interesting things in here, just about what Cobb had to do. And then one of the most interesting parts about the full settlement, and again, it's in the description, I'd recommend you just go and read through it, is that in the case of the Cobb settlement, downpipes were specifically talked about. And so, like, you know, there's a recent discovery, and now it makes perfect sense that Cobb has discontinued all of their downpipes. And now it's clear why. But I want to touch on that, but I want to talk about some of these interesting details of what Cobb has to do. So they obviously had to remove all the delete features from their software, which they've done.
But it says from their custom tuning software, so that doesn't mean from. Are they talking about from the Accessport itself, or are they talking about
from the Protuner software?
From the Protuner software. Yeah. So that would indicate that they have looked at the software and said, hey, you can still have custom Protuners out there, which I think is wonderful because that's what I do for a living.
Yeah,
and if they were to say
the ability to turn off the check engine lights and to remove readiness and all these sorts of things, that's I think what they had to remove. Mm-hmm. But I mean, and it kind of stands to reason maybe that, like, if you're not basically, if all the normal emission systems are online and are running and are saying that everything is functioning correctly, then probably the car is running correctly.
Yes, yeah. So what's neat about that for me is that that's my job.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, right, exactly.
Like, I am the custom tuning software guy.
And I guarantee you that Cobb had to fight hard for that.
Oh, yeah, and I mean, during all of this, I was having to brainstorm because I was saying to myself, what if this decree comes out and it says, there can only be these off-the-shelf maps that are CARB certified, and you can only sell that. There can't be custom tuning software. Right. That is a very possible thing. I could still make a business of having just like a business where I do bolt-ons, custom packages, not even custom packages, predetermined packages with off-the-shelf maps that are CARB certified, and just test that and say, hey, if you come to me, I will make sure your car is safe and faster, and it follows what the Cobb off-the-shelf maps are supposed to do. But I would have to expand because I'm so busy with custom tunes that I would have to say, these are all going to, from now on, be off-the-shelf maps with different packages that are offered. And so I would have to go from being this like Subaru guru that really just continuously thinks and studies about how to make these engines run better, to being someone that just tests their maps and does it on all sorts of makes, Ford and Volkswagen. I wouldn't need to know how to do anything other than run my dyno and tell the customer, hey, I saw a bunch of knock on your car or whatever. And that's what I want to talk about, is that these cars are all, despite having a CARB-approved map, all these cars run a little bit different. And even with that in mind, even their off-the-shelf maps, by allowing us to have custom tuning software, I can make cars that are even better and better calibrated. The upshot of that is the performance is better, but the real important thing is that the emissions gets better and better as the fuel trims get smaller and smaller.
This is the thing that I think, if I'm looking 5 years ahead, is that we as the aftermarket have to find a way to do the testing and show them that we can do the testing. Because just because you're making more power doesn't necessarily mean that you're making more emissions. And like the CARB approved maps that Cobb has, that's the beginning proof of that.
Oh yeah.
You know, I mean, they've proven that they can have these different maps that make more power, but that still pass all of the CARB certification. So it does not emit more. It is definitely possible to do. You know that has to be possible to a greater degree than even what Cobb has gotten certifications for so far. But the big X factor is the testing.
Mm-hmm.
Because, you know, for Cobb to be able to do that testing, they have to take the car in that configuration and then run it through the testing with either the SEMA garage or the CARB certification to get that end result.
Yes.
And so I think that's what we have to figure out, and we have to work with the EPA and CARB to develop going forward, is the ability to do more testing so that we can show what we're able to do.
Yeah.
Because again, I never bet against the aftermarket, because we will figure out a way, but they have to meet us halfway by letting us do the testing to show,
or giving us a target, essentially.
Yeah. To show that we can do it, because we can. It's just we have to know what the test is and be able to do the test to know that we've hit the target. Because we'll hit the target, we just have to have the ability to do it.
Yeah.
So, all right, we'll maybe come back to this at the end. But so the downpipe part of this Cobb settlement is the interesting part, and it's directly relevant to that. So, I've not seen any of these before where downpipes were called out specifically. Mm-hmm. But like historically, the first time that TGV deletes were called out was in the Rally Sport Direct settlement, and that was pretty much the end of TGV deletes. Mm-hmm. Because once it's a single line item that's called out in one of these settlements, the advantage and disadvantage of that is that then everybody knows in the industry, well, okay, this is a hot button thing. They've all got to go away. And in the case of this one, the new addition is the downpipes. Mm-hmm. And, I mean, Cobb's been making downpipes forever.
What's the sentence there? I didn't see that.
Boy, okay.
More shuffling. Sorry, folks.
Yes, no, that's okay. It's defeat. Basically, all right. So it's exhaust replacement pipes, and this is on page 11 of 18 of the settlement. It says, so some aftermarket hardware defeat products change, remove, or replace essential physical elements. This often involves removing the motor vehicle's entire exhaust system, in which the aftermarket systems are installed, and installing replacement exhaust systems that contain no after-treatment systems or after-treatment systems being catalytic converters that are not as effective as the OEM systems. The examples include the straight pipes and catted downpipes, and they specifically say catted downpipes. Mm-hmm. And they're referred to as exhaust replacement pipes. So their argument here is that they're not as effective as OEM.
Yeah.
And so to the testing point, I mean, I've been told multiple times that so CARB has a standard for what they require for a replacement catalytic pipe that has a catalytic converter in it, which is basically that it has to be identical to the OEM one that is coming off. So it has to be same location, same catalytic converter inlet and outlet diameter. The flanges on either end of the pipe have to be the same as factory. It's literally identical. And so the main manufacturer that we've seen and that we now have access to is MagnaFlow, that has CARB-approved downpipes. And there's also a time limit, like basically while the catalytic converters are under warranty, which I want to say is like 8 or 10 years. Mm-hmm. If you have an issue, you just need to replace it with a factory pipe. But then once you're past that point where it's no longer under warranty, there at least is a provision to give an aftermarket company like MagnaFlow the ability to reproduce that pipe, obviously at a less lower cost, hopefully. But they have to pass all the same certifications, and it has to meet all of these requirements. The difference here with the aftermarket downpipes is I know that the aftermarket could design a downpipe that has bigger diameter cats, bigger diameter pipes, different flanges on the end, like a bell mouth downpipe
on the outlet,
instead of a flat flange, and probably still pass. But the problem is that they won't test it.
Yeah.
And this is where like hopefully the Chevron Deference is going to come in. I mean, so what this means is that the EPA cannot just specifically say no, this is not compliant, and that be the end of it. Now it can, a question like this can go to the court of law, and a judge can make a ruling.
Yeah.
Now that doesn't mean that the judge would rule in the favor that they have to be tested, but I think it seems like if the aftermarket could produce a pipe that would meet all of the same emissions standards and requirements as the original equipment one,
Mm-hmm.
and pass all the same tests. If it'll pass the same tests, to me it would be hard to justify not making that part available.
Yeah. Especially since that would, having those constraints on it would definitely affect performance. Whereas if we can get something that works just as well with maybe larger diameter or a bell mouth, you can improve performance while keeping that same emissions compliance.
And possibly gain a little bit of efficiency. I mean, I remember historically this was, when Stage 2 kits were available that included downpipes, one of the interesting surprises there was you would actually usually, if the driving was exactly the same, which it rarely was because you get excited about the loud pedal with more power, but if you drove exactly the same, you'd actually get a little bit better fuel economy because the exhaust is less restrictive.
Yeah.
So there's an efficiency gain if you can meet the same emissions and still have the efficiency gain. If we can get them to test them, then it would be available.
And that's actually a win for the idea that emissions can help the world.
Well, and it's just the aftermarket could actually do better.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
Sometimes it's just a question of being able to get to the same level in terms of function or efficiency or whatever is the OEs, but the aftermarket sometimes can do better.
Oh yeah, I mean I feel personally that ethanol is that right there.
Sure. That's another huge one. Yeah, that's another thing where, like, it's pretty well known that the emissions from running E85 are lower than gasoline, even in a properly running vehicle. If you have it running properly in both fuels, the car that's running E85 will have less emissions, less particulates coming out of the tailpipe.
Oh yeah.
But like this is to the flex fuel.
I'm currently helping a guy who recently imported a fully legal WRX that is bone stock. And he can't get it through emissions. I just got it through emissions yesterday on ethanol. And I did leave everything pretty much, I left everything stock. And so that ability to use ethanol is not just documented. But the problem right now for me is that I see people in Denver who have newer cars. I saw a guy on Facebook the other day that has a CTSV that is bone stock that can't get through emissions. And he says it's getting worse every time. And I have seen those emissions standards get tighter on even my Baja, which was made in 2004. So you can see that the state is getting more strict about it, and cars that are fully stock are not getting through emissions. So we can see that by having this allowance, and even not having the allowance, telling people, like, throw a gallon of E85 in there and go back and test, and seeing that difference in their emissions, it says something about the possibilities, even when crudely done.
By just putting a different fuel in the tank.
Yeah, by just putting a different fuel in the tank. And when we can fine-tune that different fuel, it gets even better. So not only with regards to making more power, I think that's a win for everybody in the whole world.
And that's if we as a community are open to trying to basically show that we can do the same, if not better job as the OEs for having cars be compliant.
Yeah.
Then that's, I think, the long term, like, that's what gives us the best options long term. Is it going to be cheaper? Probably not. That's the question with these downpipes. Like, if, let's say you had this design of a downpipe that will pass, like, what catalytic converters would you have to use to get it to pass? What would the cost of those catalytic converters be? What is the cost of the testing and development, because that's going to have to get rolled into the end cost of this downpipe. But if it ends up costing $2,000, $2,500, would the benefit of having this $2,500 compliant downpipe and the power gained from it, would that be worth it? And that's the calculation that at some point is going to have to be done, hopefully.
Yeah, and I think that's one calculation for a guy with a stock car still running the stock downpipe. It's different for him than for a guy that bought a used car that doesn't have a downpipe and he's trying to get through emissions.
Right.
If in that case you have a guy that would have to go to a dealership and pay $4,000 to $6,000 for a set of factory cats versus this aftermarket offering that improves efficiency, gets even better emissions, can be used with a flex fuel kit, and all around not only appeases the EPA, but it appeases the world, and it gives everybody what they want, whether it's horsepower or better emissions.
And you make an interesting point in that sometimes the emissions thresholds will actually get lower on older cars. So like if they drop the particulate threshold that all cars have to hit, sometimes that is now lower than what this, like a 2004 20-year-old car has historically had to hit. And I've seen this happen a handful of times. This will only mean anything to people here in Colorado, but there was a local guy who's no longer with us, Larry Hot Rod.
Oh, yeah.
That had the port-injected GL, Subaru GL. So it's like a GL wagon that had a single injector, and he came in at one point, this is years ago, because he hadn't passed emissions, and he had always passed emissions before in this old GL. And it was exactly this thing, because he, being Larry, he had all of the emissions certificates from historically from this car, and he pulls out this one that he just tried to get through, and it failed, and we were comparing them and looked, the particulate threshold, it's much
lowering and lowering, yeah.
So so like you could say, they're doing that to kind of clean up the air and to make it so that if you want to have this older car on the road, it's got to be as more or less in the same compliance level as these new cars. Mm-hmm. Well, how are you going to do that if they have these older systems
that you're not allowed to change?
They're not allowed to change. Well, the possible answer would be work with the aftermarket, give the aftermarket the ability to test and vet a new system that would then allow this older car to meet this newer, lower.
Otherwise, you're just forcing cars off the road that are otherwise very much still usable, and you're creating more pollution through the mining of a new car. Honestly, I've seen a statistic about the Porsche 911, which is that something like 80% of every 911 ever built is still on the road.
Yeah.
Because they're A, collectible and desirable, but B, they're reliable as heck. And that means that, like, when we look at the carbon footprint of the 911, it's much lower than some disposable car that burns completely clean, yet you're not mining the metals from the earth or reforging the recycled metals. So by recycling cars, you can actually argue, it's the same argument as against the Tesla with the battery mining and stuff like that. It's like, hey, it may not be polluting now, but the production is a big polluter.
Right.
So I think it's true that the 911 is arguably one of the cleanest cars on earth, not because of I work with a lot of like ITB older air-cooled 911s. Those engines, you have to cool them with fuel because there is no coolant.
Right.
So you're literally, when you're floored, they kind of run rich. And yet, even with all that in mind, they are more environmental just because of that carbon footprint.
and ultimately, what it comes down to is, it's just the testing is the key, I think, is the next big key. Like, if what SEMA is doing with the SEMA garage, they have 2 facilities. If there could be more SEMA garages out there. I mean, if testing would be more of an option for these aftermarket companies, or if the cost goes down, or even yourself. I mean, people that are tuners, calibrators professionally, most of you guys have dynos, which is this giant, relatively expensive tool that you need to be able to do the job.
Yeah.
So if they could come out and say, well, all right, well, if you want to be able to tune a car and do some kind of certification, like, what is another tool that you could have, like a 5-gas analyzer or something along these lines?
Yeah.
So, like, I'm going to tune the car to make sure it runs. Then I'm going to analyze the exhaust coming out of the tailpipe. Mm-hmm.
Then I think they have some soak tests where they have to freeze the car as though you're in the Arctic and make sure it still would pass emissions.
Do the cold test and all that sort of thing. But if we know what it is, and if there could be some kind of common ground for standardized testing that could be done, like that. I mean, I think as enthusiasts, as tuners, again, with the long-term view, we'd all be willing to work towards these goals, reach and attain these goals, so that we could, if we love, maybe the equivalent in the Subaru community would be a GC, or like a Bug-Eye WRX or some, a GD WRX, something that at this point is basically 20 years old, 30 years old, to find a way to keep these cars on the road.
Yeah.
And keep them compliant, keep them clean, keep them running really well. I mean that's the win for everybody, if we can get there. It's just I think testing is the key.
Yeah.
I agree. All right. Well, Harvey, I think we're gonna have to wrap it up there because we're running out of time. And I
All
think
right.
and I think my goal is going to be to try and get this out as soon as possible. So for you at home, if you're listening and watching, let us know what you think in the comments below. What does this mean? Is this, do we hope that hopefully, I would hope, like us, you're hoping that other companies that are maybe going through this are going to come through the other end like Cobb and give us more and better options as enthusiasts, as tuners, and all this, so that we can keep doing with our cars what we want to do, keep the cars on the road, and that sort of thing. But totally understand if you've got a different opinion, but let us know in the comments below.
Yeah, but I mean, I think the goal is happy customers, and I mean, but at the same time, we can't be breaking laws. But we still, I mean, ultimately, what makes these customers happy is being able to be an individual and have a unique car that they sort of came up with the plan for and individualized. And a lot of that is cosmetic, but a lot of it really is the power plant and the horsepower.
To be able to enjoy the car.
Yeah,
enjoy the car the way that you want to enjoy it, but know that, like, to me, like, as I get older, like, the amount of steps that I'm willing to go through to just keep being able to drive the car is getting a little bit less, because my time and my patience is getting a little bit less than it once was.
And you see alternatives that are working well, whether it's a Hellcat or a Tesla.
Yeah, exactly. So, thanks very much for watching. Let us know in the comments what you think. Harvey, thanks very much for your time coming on the podcast. And until next time, stay tuned to Flatirons Tuning.
Yeah.
Thanks everyone for tuning in to the Flatirons Syndicate Motorsports Podcast. Once again, we'd like to let you know that your support is what makes this show possible. Be sure to check out our online store at FlatironStuning.com for any of your aftermarket or OEM Subaru parts needs. And as always, stay tuned with Flatirons Tuning.